I think while all the politics would suggest that Trump and Burnham are probably going to have a slightly rocky time, the personalities, the personal aspects could actually be quite warm and loving.
Welcome to the State of It USA, the Times podcast that tries to make sense of Trump's America. I'm Katie Balls, Washington editor and columnist for The Times and Sunday Times.
And I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal and columnist for The Times. Well, this week, Britain has another new prime minister. What will Donald Trump make of it? What kind of a relationship can he expect with the United States? We'll also be talking about Iran, significant escalation in terms of US casualties happening over the weekend. What could be next there? And why are people so cross, especially over here in America, about Christopher Nolan's Odyssey? Well, let's start, Katie. Britain has a new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, took office Monday afternoon in the UK. Inevitably, the relationship between the US and the UK is going to be important.
I know people at home are fed up with politics. I hear you, and I want to be honest with you. We have not been good enough, and we need to be better. We will be. We will make this moment a circuit breaker for Britain, bringing forward the biggest changes in the last 40 years. A new political model and a new economic model.
I've written my Wall Street Journal column about the new Prime Minister this week, and the Wall Street Journal headline writers decided to put on top of to call the column, which I think is rather amusing, there's a Y in the day, so there must be another Prime Minister of Britain, which I think probably does capture the kind of sense that Britain is just a revolving carousel of prime ministers now. But what do you think with Andy Burnham taking office? What can we expect about the relationship with Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a global level, we are becoming a bit of a joke for the turnover of prime ministers. And even when I interviewed JD Vance a couple of weeks ago, he was trying to be quite diplomatic, but he did say, when he looks at the system, Andy Burnham coming in, didn't give much of an opinion on Andy Burnham, but did say that, he sees 6 prime ministers in 10 years and thinks something's very broken in British politics. And Andy Burnham is also saying something's broken in British politics.
I think the British people think there's something broken in British politics. So
Exactly, but we'll do
everybody's-
multiple choice on what? But what is interesting is one of the things you hear from the Andy Burnham camp is this sense that they think one of the flaws of Keir Starmer's premiership was this over-focus on foreign affairs, and often what comes up in that conversation is Donald Trump. And there's also a bit of a hint, at least, that Keir Starmer was too deferential to Donald Trump, and he tried this big charm offensive and it didn't really work. And therefore, you hear that Andy Burnham, I think, gave an interview to Gary Lineker, none other, to talk about various things like the football, but said in this interview that he would be, he'd try and meet people where they're at, and he was not unafraid to disagree. Donald Trump has called Andy Burnham extremely liberal.
I hear he's extremely liberal, extremely. So that means he probably won't open up the Odyssey.
He's also done a post being quite nice about him on oil and gas, which we'll get to. But I think the general feeling I'm picking up in the Trump administration when it comes to Andy Burnham is, one, there's a bit of who the hell is this Andy guy? But secondly, for those who actually do have a UK focus, I think there is trepidation about some of the positions and directions they could take.
I think that you mentioned that Truth Social that Trump put out, I think, on Sunday. It was a classic sort of double punch from Trump, wasn't it? Because on the one hand, it said, wonderful, the people of Aberdeen are celebrating because Andy Burnham's going to be, going to allow more North Sea oil drilling, which, he's kind of, I think he said is that Britain needs to be more pragmatic on that. But Trump obviously immediately embraced it as, Burnham's going to be pro-oil. And of course, Trump is pro-oil, and Trump has a particular interest in Aberdeen and Scotland and all that because of his past and present with golf courses and his family and all of that. So it was kind of like a welcome. The welcome mat was laid out there quickly for Andy Burnham. But then in the same Truth Social, what did he call Britain? He said Britain was a poverty stricken disaster. And needed to change. So, I think that sort of sets it up rather nicely the way.
And
the Wall
also,
Street Journal
Gerry, the Truth Social post announced a policy that Andy Burnham has not announced.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
which goes perhaps a little bit further than Andy Burnham may on oil and gas. So I was speaking to Trump figures saying, "That was such a nice welcome for Andy Burnham." And
Well,
then I
remember
s
Donald Trump broke the news that Keir Starmer was standing down. Do you remember that? So he's got a bit of a habit of getting out in front of the news.
totally. And then you have the UK side saying, "Oh, is Andy Burnham actually announcing new drilling, or is he actually just saying on the projects at Rosebank, they're gonna be looking at doing it and they're not, killing it right now?" There's perhaps an element of mischief in what Trump is posting.
Yeah, and look, I think it's interesting. Look, exactly as you say, I'm sure Burnham is giving all the signals. I mean, domestic politics terms, Donald Trump is enormously unpopular in Britain, right? And the British people sort of do seem to be kind of crying out for, well, certainly the media do, which they always have done, the Love Actually moment that we're all so it's become such a tired cliche in British sort of foreign policy. That moment when the Prime Minister publicly denounces the American president and makes that breach that supposedly everybody wants to make. Everybody also knows that in real diplomatic, in terms of real diplomacy, that would never be in Britain's interest. But it looks at Burnham. There's potential political upside for Burnham to take a somewhat less obsequious approach to Donald Trump than Keir Starmer did, certainly in his first months in office. From the US side, Katie, and I've talked to some people about this in the last week or so. I mean, Trump is so unpredictable. You just don't know, right? I mean, on the face of it, Trump and Burnham would seem to have absolutely nothing in common. Burnham, if it is true that Burnham is somewhat more to the left and wants to push maybe the government a little, we'll see how that government unfolds. But the sort of general sense is that the party wants to move a little bit leftwards, and things like. I mean, he seems like he's going to maintain many of the policies, but if he is a little bit more in favor of welfare spending, in favor of potentially higher taxes, particularly on the wealthy. You'd think that'd put him a mile away from Donald Trump. And, ideologically, surely they're a mile away. But you never know with Trump. Trump has this ability to sort of latch on to people personally. He does seem to have a bit of a thing for kind of handsome men. And, I guess most people think Burnham's probably quite handsome. And to a, remember he loves Prince William. And just the strangest thing with Trump, when Zoran Mamdani became mayor of New York, the Democratic Socialist, probably even to the left of Andy Burnham, everybody thought, "Oh my God, what kind of a relationship is he going to have with Donald Trump?" Donald Trump, they had a kind of a love fest. So I think while all the politics would suggest that Trump and Burnham are probably going to have a slightly rocky time, the personalities, the personal aspects could actually be quite warm and lovey.
Yeah, I think having a bit of character is not a bad thing with Donald Trump, and we saw that with Vandani and that loving in the Oval Office after all this rhetoric. I think that structurally, there are complaints that the US has on the UK, which emerged under Keir Starmer and it could resurface under Andy Burnham. And I think certainly in the UK, there's a feeling of why are they so obsessed with us almost when it comes to the US, saying broken Britain, here's what you need civilizational erasure. That was the phrase in the national security strategy about Britain and Europe. But there'll be a few key moments, which is defense funding. You already have the US Ambassador Warren Stevens in the Times this week warning that the UK needs to put up really and not just delay these payments. Um, where kind of the role of Ed Miliband in this government is going to be really important, because I don't think Donald Trump is lying in bed at night thinking about Ed Miliband if Donald Trump is sleeping. But instead, I think certainly for those with a UK focus, they think about Ed Miliband and they do not see him as a friend of America in the way they see other British politicians. And therefore, there are warnings. I reported with Steve Swinford a few weeks ago from the US side saying, don't make him chancellor. I also don't think they'd love it if he was foreign secretary. And I think there's a few clashes that could happen there. And then ultimately, when it comes to energy, which is where we get to that announcement, energy is important to Donald Trump and the administration because they think the UK is a poor country right now, which cannot do the things it needs to do to be a good ally. And they think energy and improving the economy is the only way you're going to fix that. So that's where you get to. Then I think you have the secondary issues like freedom of speech. But I think the core things really are the economy. And that's where Andy Burnham will just have things which probably no amount of charm quite gets you around.
Yeah, and I think broadening it out from sort of the personalities of Burnham and Trump. I had a conversation when Starmer did announce he was standing down, whatever it was, a month ago, I had a conversation with a very, very prominent business leader in the US who invests a lot in the UK, employs a lot of people there, it's a huge business there. And his first question was, do you know who's going to be the new Chancellor of the Exchequer? And, needless to say, of course, I didn't. And he said, because that could be a disaster. He said, Britain's economy, desperately needs growth. He thought Rachel Reeves had actually done an okay job of sort of holding the kind of fiscal ring for 2 years without sort of disaster and sticking to fairly sort of stable macroeconomic policies. But he thought if there was a very kind of a more left-leaning chancellor, then that would be a disaster. So I think there's a lot of attention on what the UK does on its economy, not just sort of at the Donald Trump, the sort of the piquant Donald Trump truth social observations, but actually from those people who have a lot of business interests and who actually want the UK to succeed economically. There's a really strong desire that the UK do something to get its growth rate up. It's just been stuck, as we know, mired in this low productivity economy now for more than 15 years. And I think, there's going to be a lot of attention to that. And if this new government were to move in a more, leftward, even more public spending, even higher taxes, I think that would be greeted very, very unfavorably in the US.
Yeah, and then I think there is this other layer, which I don't think is quite so much the White House as many in their orbit, which does just have this fascination with the UK and wants the UK to be back like the old days. And I don't think they're going to get that under Andy Burnham. But I also think that one of the things I keep picking up in Trump world is a sense that they're saying, you know, is the UK government or is the British ambassador trying to just befriend Democrats? Are they already deciding that the guard is changing? And they're a bit worried about that. So I think, if Andy Burnham looks as though his inroads are with the Democrats, that's probably one of the things that could cause another issue potentially. But with that, Gerry, we're going to take a break. And when we're back, we'll be talking about escalation in Iran, as well as your trip to the Odyssey. And we're back to Iran. Over the weekend, 3 US servicemen died, 2 in Jordan and 1 in Iraq. Gerry, one of the things we've spoken about is this idea of almost a contained war where it doesn't go away, but is pretty controlled in terms of what we're seeing. But do you think that the rise in fatalities, the fact that they're, it's something that could go up further, means that we could be entering new territory?
It's possible, yeah, and I think you put it exactly right, Katie. What's the old line about war plans collapse as soon as a war starts? We talked about this last week. I wrote about it in my Times column last week. I think Trump is sort of trapped in a kind of performative sort of war in which the US can't retreat, can't leave Iran in control of the Strait of Hormuz without seeming to do something about it, but is very reluctant to escalate, to do the kind of serious warfare that would be needed to break Iran's hold over the Strait of Hormuz. So we're in this sort of, kind of a phony war. We talked about it last week. The caveat, which we are seeing play out, and we saw play out over the weekend, if you like, is that war inevitably does have a kind of a momentum of its own and produces outcomes that produce other outcomes, and war moves in a way that is not predictable and not necessarily in accordance with the preferences of those who are conducting it. And the deaths of these service members, as you say, 2 in Jordan, and there's also, it looks like a third serviceman was missing. That sadly looks like he or she may also possibly have died, and the death in Iraq too, potentially 4 deaths in the space of 24 hours, is a pretty serious escalation for the US. That would take, US is, to that point, I think it only lost 14 service members. So this would be quite a significant increase in losses. And that produces, again, as I say, its own logic and its own momentum. And the US then does feel obliged to respond perhaps in a more aggressive way, in a way that, avenges those deaths and tries to, signal to the Iranians that this could get very, very dangerous and could get ugly for them. I still think the diplomacy continues. That even as we do seem to be locked in this cycle of escalation, there is a continuing effort, on a diplomatic effort, quite an urgent diplomatic effort, to wind this down, or at least to reduce the intensity of the conflict and maybe get another ceasefire. So I think although the risk is certainly higher today than it was before the weekend that we could be entering a much more volatile and dangerous state of the war, I still think Trump is not willing to do what would be necessary to actually break Iran's stranglehold on the strait, which would be, General Barry McCaffrey, the leading military figure, played a prominent role in America's wars in the 90s and early 2000s. And he was talking at the weekend, he was saying this would probably need 100,000 US troops, a major, ground and amphibious operation. And I just don't see any evidence that Trump is willing to do that. So while I think things can get out of control, and certainly, a rising number of US casualties, fatalities would be something that would really have to feed into the way the US responds to this, I still think there's no willingness. People I've spoken to, I spoke to someone on Friday who's been a pretty much of an Iran hawk for years, who's been pressing the US to be more aggressive, was totally against the Obama administration's approach, very close, a Republican, close to a number of people in the administration. He thinks Iran has basically won this, that the regime is not broken. The regime is stronger than it probably ever was. It's got a tight stranglehold of the Strait of Hormuz. Without massive military intervention, the US isn't going to break that, and was basically saying, his view was that the US needs to find the most sort of elegant way it can to get out of this, because it's not going to win the war according to its own objectives.
Yeah, and I think it's quite clear they have been trying to find a way out when you look at the US side. So the memorandum, a tough pill for some to swallow, that now really is coming close to being completely falling apart. Obviously, we're used to Trump having the rhetoric and these last minute saves coming in. But what I've been picking up is just to your point, the concern that because they haven't managed to find an elegant way out or just a way out, with every day that goes on, obviously the current fatality is tragic, but there is a fear that you're going to get something which you cannot ignore. So, something goes so wrong that then Trump is forced into a corner and has to do some drastic retaliation, which takes us into a full blown messy conflict in a way that it hasn't up to this point. And there was a feeling of turning the corner. You almost can also see, when Trump is now, asked about the Iran war and he's trying to focus on the World Cup final, there it does feel as though, there's a slight level of exasperation at this point coming from parts of the administration. And, you have a White House comms team who I think have always struggled to have a coherent narrative for the war, because Trump has kept changing what it is. So now he's asked, if it's meant to be a couple of weeks, he said, well, we're now doing something even bigger. But obviously, he's also said in the past that they managed to completely obliterate what the Iranians were doing. And, ugh, you know, I just think it's becoming an even tougher task for even trying to have a narrative, to the point that lots of people I've spoken to who are pretty, Trump allies, they're in that orbit. Um, Even in private, they're not even trying to kind of put a positive spin on this. And I think there is just a sense that I would just call it trepidation that things could actually get quite a lot worse if they can't probably stomach something which isn't particularly good for America.
Yeah, I think from Iran's point of view, Iran is playing a potentially dangerous game here, because look, what they're trying to do is they're trying to do two things. One, emphasize that they have complete control over that waterway, by attacking shipping and by taking out what they regard as enemies, and attacking their enemies in the region, and at the same time also trying to inflict enough damage on the US that what they Iranians already know is an unpopular war here in the US will become even more unpopular. But there is a point at which, if they do inflict, really significant damage, and again, as tragic as these losses are, if the numbers are, if so far it may be up to 15 or 16 US fatalities from this war. That's obviously very small in historical terms, in terms of any conflict that the US has done. But if they really escalate to a point where that number goes much higher, significantly higher, then the US will be obliged, perhaps even Trump, reluctant as he is, will be obliged to escalate in ways. Now, the Iranians probably calculating in ways that will ultimately be disastrous for the US and will only ultimately, ensure Iran's hegemony in the region. But they could provoke the US into, a much more significant military engagement. And I'm not sure that in the end is something that would necessarily end well for them.
Well, yeah, and at that point also it becomes something that does define Trump's presidency. But Jerry, I wondered, given your wisdom and obviously your time covering American politics over various conflicts, I mean, as things currently stand, how do you think the war fits into U.S. military conflicts in terms of how it is going for the president at the time? It's not quite the disaster levels previous ones, partly because it hasn't got to that stage, right?
Right, right. But I do think it will. I mean, as it stands, it looks like another failed Greater Middle East venture. Would be largely brought about by the fact that the U.S. is politically unwilling or unable to make the kind of commitment necessary to really win a war, on the scale of wars that the US has won, when it's actually definitively won wars like World War One and World War Two. That took, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of US and millions of US forces to fight those wars. The US, the paradox of US as a military, as a superpower right now is it is unquestionably the most important, the biggest, strongest, most effective military in the world. But there are two ways of looking at it. There's a reluctance on the part of politicians and the people to get involved in wars, to use that military to conduct wars that require perhaps significant losses in far-flung parts of the world for questionable U.S. objectives. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that there's still a kind of arrogance about the U.S. The U.S. enters these wars thinking there'll be a cakewalk. We're so strong. We've got the best military in the world. We can knock these little regimes off around the world. We can take care of them as we did, say, in Venezuela. But as we kind of thought we would do in Iraq, we were told Iraq would be a cakewalk. We were told we would completely remake Afghanistan. We were going to remake the Middle East. There's an arrogance and a hubris about it, and I think this is absolutely right in line. Again, as you say, Katie, thankfully the casualties for the US have not been as great as Iraq or Afghanistan, anywhere near as great. But I think the damage to US prestige probably is as great. And in terms of leaving, at least with Iraq and Afghanistan, look, there are people still argue about this. Iraq is a better country than it was 30 years ago when Saddam Hussein ran it. I'm not in any way, in the end, defending the Iraq war. I think the costs were too high. But Iraq is not a threat to the world. Afghanistan, is back with the Taliban, but is less of a threat to the world. Iran, by contrast, if it emerges from this with the US kind of with the tail between its legs, that would be strategically a very bad blow, because it would, Iran is a serious country and would be a serious threat to the region and to the world if it somehow emerges from this, with something that can plausibly claim to be a victory.
Now, finally, while the Iran war may look set to dominate Trump's presidency and continue to divide opinion, is actually another issue that's really tearing America apart at the moment. And Jerry, you've done some first-hand reporting for us. You've gone to the cinema.
I have. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Some really deep reporting, some deep research. The Odyssey is, this is the Christopher Nolan epic, biggest movie blockbuster of the year. Katie, there's been a lot of attacks on it from
Yeah.
conservatives, from people on the right. They don't
It's
like
making a lot of money, but it is
it
getting a
is.
lot of criticism, and
Exactly.
it's pretty wide-ranging. Some of it's about the casting. They don't like the fact that Helena Troy has a black actress who
Lupita
does not
Nyong'o.
have
Yeah,
white
yeah,
arms, for
yeah.
example.
Yeah. No, exactly. There's a trans actor, and by the way, there was a lot of nonsense about that in advance. There was suggestions that he was playing Achilles. It's not actually. The role is a rather smaller character, important but smaller character. The larger critique was that it was somehow a kind of a desecration of this great work of defining work of Western civilization, which fundamentally, was woke. It sort of fundamentally undermined the whole, the morality of Western civilization. Frankly, I find that silly. It is Christopher Nolan imposing the same sort of moral framework that he's imposed on previous films. I mean, most notably Oppenheimer, which was also an extraordinary epic, but where he, where the kind of the sort of defining moral philosophical question is, is warfare terrible, and are we in the West terrible people because we created a nuclear weapon? There's kind of there's a little bit the moral framework that's been imposed on the Odyssey is Nolan's idea that Odysseus feels this sort of terrible guilt about having sacked Troy, especially having sacked Troy by deceit through the Trojan horse, and is therefore somehow condemned to this Odyssey, and to his moral and physical torture. And that is obviously at odds with the story itself and with sort of that period, the period of Greek kind of morality and the role of the gods and the relationship between the gods and men and all of that. But this is what art is, right? I mean, this is how art evolves. It doesn't undermine the fundamental story. It's I think, and indeed, this it's an interpretation, which is a questionable one, not an illegitimate one, but a questionable one. But in terms of the idea that it's sort of somehow weakening Western civilization, it's just nonsense. Because what Nolan has done, I think, has been able to bring this great iconic work to an audience of presumably tens of millions who will see this movie, and it's basically again, you can argue about the details of the morality, but the story is an extraordinary one, and at the end, it's a story about a hero who does the right thing, and who observes the laws and morals of his age and of his time, and is fundamentally a good man. I don't see how you can really get too worked up about that.
Okay. Yeah, I do slightly also wonder how many of these critics were sat at home reading the Odyssey, word for word, and studying it, and experts so much as just finding something to get quite annoyed about. But as you say, if people do go back and now watch the film and then they go back to the original script, you are bringing it to a new audience. But perhaps a more traditional version of this, of which we've seen many before, isn't going to have that effect, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, look, I'm not, but I am my woke radar. I defer to no one, Katie, in terms of my woke radar. I listen and watch stuff all the time, in sort of in the culture that enrages me, that I find just infuriating. And I'm very very attentive to the risks of it, and there are some dreadful garbage that comes out of Hollywood or the BBC or lots of other places which really are, undermining of our civilization.
Can you give us,
This
Gerry,
isn't it.
just because this is the first time we've discovered your woke radar on this podcast. Um, so on the scale, Odyssey's pretty low. What's been the highest grievance in recent years?
Oh
What has
my
actually
gosh.
offended you?
Oh, that is a good question. Well, I mean, to be honest, sort of like almost everything comes out of the BBC. I tell you what really
Wolf
offended me.
Hall? No. Some people got angry Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall wasn't accurate enough to history, but I don't think there was a woke drive.
100%. Oh, so that I mean, as by the way, as a Catholic and a man who thinks is probably one of the greatest men in history is St Thomas More. That was just outrageous. Yeah, I mean, just terrible,
I quite
terrible
enjoyed it.
ahistorical nonsense. From someone, of course, who sort of famously had nice words to say about all kinds of enemies of Western civilization. But yeah, I mean, that is a good example. I think again, I think much of what comes, there is so much of what comes out. I mean, a good example, I do think, since we're talking about it, I think it was a drama on British TV. I think it might have been Channel 4 called Adolescence a couple of years ago.
Yes.
How about it? Technically brilliant,
Netflix.
artistically brilliant, well, beautifully performed. Netflix, sorry, it was a Netflix. But but I had a real problem with that. I mean, this was for because this is the kind of this is the wokery problem that this depiction of the thing they choose to focus on is a highly dysfunctional young white kid who is supposedly turned into this awful monstrous human being by his circumstances. There are so many things you could choose to focus on about the dysfunctionality of British society over the last 20 years. I'll just throw one out there, which is for example, the Muslim rape gangs. But instead, our cultural masters choose to pick on a fictional story, obviously fictionalized version of some sort of stories that are based in reality about about the evils that attend sort of white working class culture. And yeah, so that's
Yeah. The
one of the best
BBC
examples I
did
can think of.
have a good drama on what happened in Rotherham and grooming gangs, but I suppose where I think you get it different is adolescence became, I think at one point, politicians suggesting they were gonna reshape policy based
Yeah,
on a Netflix
yeah,
show. And
Absolutely.
whereas the Rotherham one, they're not showing the grooming gang show in schools as far as I can tell. So that they're picking the bits which kind of fit more of a narrative.
Exactly right, and it became the again, it not only became a national talking point and policy needs to change, but it became the sort of received wisdom about the obviously, in the view of the our cultural elites, the defining pathology of our age, which is the various, social conditions and behavior of white working class kids. And again, not disputing that there are profound problems. And indeed, as I said, that story has got its sort of antecedents in fact rather than fiction. But the idea that that is the defining pathology of British life is to me uh, deeply problematic.
And with that, I think that's all we have time for this week, but we will be back next week and also back another time where Gerry is on the woke radar scale in the future. So thank you for listening. And if you like this podcast, do rate and review.